My son said, "You're just a guest here." The will made him pay me rent monthly. The grandfather clock in the hall had just struck 4 when my son, my only child, declared that I was nothing more than a guest in my own home. He didn't shout it. He didn't argue. He said it with the casual chill of a stranger stating a fact, right as I was about to serve him a slice of his favorite apple pie, the one I'd baked for him since he was a boy. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The late afternoon sun, the color of rich amber, slanted through the tall Victorian windows of the living room. It was the time of day I loved most, when the light seemed to set the old oak furniture aglow and the dust motes danced like tiny golden spirits in the air. The scent of cinnamon and baked apples from my freshly made pie filled the house, a warm, comforting blanket against the slight autumn chill rolling in from the Savannah River. It was a scent of home, of continuity, of a life built within these walls. The grandfather clock, a wedding gift from my late husband, Arthur, chimed its 4th bell. The sound was deep, resonant, a steady heartbeat in the quiet house. I carefully slid the silver pie server under a perfect slice, the crust golden and flaky. "Here you are, Daniel," I said, my voice full of the simple pleasure of a mother caring for her son. He was sitting in Arthur's wingback chair, his legs crossed, looking every bit the man of the house. At 45, he still had the boyish hair that fell across his forehead, but his eyes held a weariness that hadn't been there a year ago. His business had failed, a small restaurant that had swallowed his savings, and he and his wife, Melissa, had moved in with me 3 months prior. "Just until we get back on our feet, Mom," he'd said. Of course, I'd agreed. What mother wouldn't? He didn't reach for the plate. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that, Mom." His tone was flat, devoid of any warmth. I paused, the plate hovering between us. "It's no trouble, dear. It's your favorite." That's when he said it. "You should remember, you're just a guest here." The words hung in the air, sharp and cold as shards of glass. My hand froze. The weight of the porcelain plate suddenly felt immense, my arm trembling with a force I couldn't control. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. The warm, cinnamon-scented air turned suffocating. A sudden, artificial coldness washed over my skin, and I realized it was the air conditioning kicking on, but it felt like the chill of a tomb. I looked past Daniel to where Melissa stood, leaning against the marble fireplace. She was a striking woman, always perfectly put together, her red nails like drops of blood against the white stone. She hadn't said a word, but she didn't need to. A smile, so faint it was barely there, played on her lips. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the quiet, confident smile of a victor watching a long-planned strategy fall perfectly into place. My gaze snapped back to my son. What did you just say?" My voice was a whisper, lost in the vastness of the room. "It's for the best, Mom," Daniel continued, his eyes avoiding mine, focusing instead on a point on the far wall. "Melissa and I have been talking. Managing a house this size, it's a lot for you. We're prepared to take over the responsibility. All of it." "Take over?" The words echoed in my head. This wasn't a discussion. It wasn't an offer to help. It was a declaration, a coup. The pie, the warm sunlight, the gentle ticking of the clock. It was all a facade. Beneath the surface of our quiet family life, a war had been waged without my knowledge, and I had just been informed of my surrender. The silver server clattered as it slipped from my numb fingers and hit the plate. The perfect slice of pie, a symbol of my love and care, now looked like a ruin. I slowly lowered the plate to the coffee table, my movements stiff, robotic. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This wasn't just disrespect. It was a calculated move, a line drawn in the sand of my own living room, and that nearly invisible smile on Melissa's face told me exactly who had drawn it. I wasn't just a mother in her son's eyes anymore. I was an obstacle, a guest in the house Arthur and I had built, in the life we had shared. And I had a terrifying feeling that my hosts were about to become very, very inhospitable. A week before the word guest was dropped like a bomb in my sunlit living room, the first tremor had already shaken the foundation of my world. It happened in Arthur's study, the one room in the house that still felt entirely his. The scent of old books, leather, and his faint, lingering pipe tobacco clung to the air like a comforting memory. It was my sanctuary, the place I went to feel close to him. That was, until they decided they wanted it to. It began with a syrupy sweetness that should have been my first red flag. Daniel and Melissa found me there, dusting Arthur's collection of maritime maps. Melissa glided in, her movements smooth and deliberate, and placed a perfectly manicured hand on my shoulder. "Eleanor, darling," she began, her voice dripping with concern. "Daniel and I were just talking. There's so much paperwork that comes with running an estate like this. Taxes, insurance, upkeep. It must be overwhelming for you." I paused, duster in hand. "It can be a lot, I suppose, but I've managed so far." "Of course you have," she purred, her fingers giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze that felt more possessive than comforting. She moved towards Arthur's grand mahogany desk, her red nails a stark, predatory splash of color against the dark wood. She ran her fingers over its polished surface as if testing its quality. "We just want to help. Let us take some of that weight off your shoulders. We could organize everything, set up digital files, just to make things simpler for you." Daniel, who had been hovering by the door, chimed in. "Yeah, Mom, we're not trying to step on your toes or anything. We just worry about you having to deal with all this alone." His words were meant to be reassuring, but they felt rehearsed. I looked from my son's earnest, anxious face to my daughter-in-law's cool, composed one. A flicker of hesitation went through me. For 3 months, they had been perfect house guests, polite, helpful, never a nuisance. But this felt different. This felt like a strategic advance, a quiet occupation of my husband's most personal space. Still, I chided myself for being suspicious. This was my son. He was just trying to help. "That's very thoughtful of you both," I said slowly. "Let me think on it. Perhaps I could make you two some iced tea?" It was a classic Southern deflection, a way to buy time and retreat to the familiar comfort of my kitchen. As I stepped into the hallway, closing the heavy oak door behind me, I heard Daniel's phone buzz. I was halfway to the staircase when his voice, now stripped of all warmth and laced with panic, cut through the silence. It was a harsh, muffled whisper, not meant for my ears. "I don't have it. I told you I don't have it yet." A pause. His voice grew more desperate. "Look, I don't care. He wants his money by the end of the month. It's my neck on the line here." I froze, my hand gripping the banister. My blood ran cold. This wasn't the tone of a man dealing with an old supplier. This was the sound of pure fear. The study door creaked open. Daniel stood there, his face pale, the phone already gone from his ear. He jumped when he saw me. "Whoa, Mom! You startled me." "Is everything all right, Daniel?" I asked, and keeping my voice even, though my heart was pounding. He forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle. Yeah, fine. Just pressure from an old supplier from the restaurant. You know how it is. They're playing hardball over the last invoice." He wouldn't meet my eyes. I held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for a glimmer of truth, but found none. I simply nodded. I see. Well, I'll go get that tea. I didn't get the tea. I walked back into the study, my mind racing. Melissa was still standing by the desk, examining a silver letter opener. She looked up and gave me a serene smile, as if nothing had happened. The lie hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. My eyes drifted to the large, oil-painted portrait of Arthur that hung above the fireplace. He looked out from the canvas with a steady, knowing gaze. He had always been the shrewd one, the one who could read a contract and a person in an instant. I looked into his painted eyes and felt a pang of deep unease. What kind of supplier threatens a man's neck over an invoice? Melissa's fingernail began to tap, tap, tap against the mahogany desk. The sound, once just an idle habit, now seemed sinister. It was the sound of a clock ticking down. My initial hesitation had now curdled into a cold, hard knot of suspicion. The first crack in the foundation of my trust had appeared, and I had the sinking feeling the whole house was about to come down. The day after my son's pronouncement, the house was suffocatingly quiet. The amber sunlight that I had once loved now seemed to cast long, accusatory shadows in every corner. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the autumn leaves against the window pane, sounded like a whisper behind my back. The feeling of being a stranger in my own home had settled deep into my bones, a cold, persistent ache. I spent the afternoon in the living room, surrounded by boxes of old photographs and keepsakes. I told myself I was organizing, but really, I was searching. I was looking for a time before my son's eyes had turned cold, before my daughter-in-law's smile held the sharp edge of a knife. I needed an anchor, something to hold onto in this new, treacherous reality. But the unease from Daniel's panicked phone call and Melissa's calculated ambition wouldn't leave me. It was a splinter under my skin, a constant nagging irritation. Something was terribly wrong, and I was tired of pretending otherwise. My hand brushed against an old, ornate carriage clock on the mantelpiece, a piece Arthur had inherited. It hadn't worked in years. Suddenly, an idea took root. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting here, waiting for the next blow to fall. I needed advice, not just any advice, but counsel from someone who knew Arthur, who understood the world we came from. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice before a warm, familiar voice answered. Abernathy? Thomas? It's Eleanor Whitford. Eleanor, what a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the honor? Thomas Abernathy had been Arthur's closest friend, a local historian with a mind as sharp as a tack and a deep love for Savannah's soul. I put on my most casual voice. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Thomas. I was just doing a bit of tidying and came across that old clock of Arthur's, the French one. I was wondering if you might know someone who could appraise it. I wouldn't even know where to begin. It was a flimsy excuse, but it was the best I could come up with. Ah, the old brass beauty. A fine piece. Of course, I know just the man, he said, his voice full of genuine enthusiasm. He gave me a name and number, and then his tone softened. But tell me, Eleanor, how are you really doing? It must be quiet in that big house all by yourself. The door to the conversation I needed was now open. Actually, Daniel and his wife, Melissa, are staying with me for a while. Ah, that's nice. Company for you, he said. But then he paused. Thomas was perceptive. He could hear the hesitation in my voice. Is everything all right? I took a breath. To be honest, Thomas, things are complicated. Daniel's business failed. They're under a lot of stress. I'm sorry to hear that, he said, and the sympathy in his voice was real. These are trying times. And a beautiful historic property like yours, well, it can attract the wrong kind of attention. You have to be careful, Eleanor. There are sharks in the water. What do you mean? I asked, my grip on the phone tightening. There's this big real estate conglomerate, he said, his voice lowering with contempt. Viridian Waterfront. They've been buying up heritage properties all along the riverfront, trying to assemble a massive parcel for some gaudy new resort. They're ruthless. They don't play by the rules. He sighed. They're clever, too. They look for the weak spots. A family in debt, a dispute between heirs. They're experts at exploiting internal problems. They find the cracks and pry them wide open until the whole thing collapses. Viridian Waterfront. The name hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't just a name. It was a memory, blurry at first, then snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. About a month ago, I'd walked into the study to find Melissa at Arthur's desk, a sleek leather portfolio open in front of her. She'd closed it in a flash, but not before I saw the logo embossed in silver on the cover. 2 stylized waves under the name, Viridian Waterfront. Oh, just some old work files, she had said with a dismissive wave of her hand. Boring real estate stuff. I should really throw this out. She had laughed it off, and I, wanting to believe the best, had thought nothing more of it. Now, her lie was as clear as the crystal glass on my shelf. Eleanor, are you still there? Thomas's voice brought me back to the present. Yes, I managed to say, my throat suddenly dry. Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Thomas. You've been a great help. Anytime, my dear. You know that. I hung up the phone, but my hand remained on the receiver, my knuckles white. I stared at the carriage clock. It was no longer just an antique. It was the key that had unlocked a dreadful secret. The pieces were slotting into place with sickening speed. Melissa wasn't just an ambitious daughter-in-law. Daniel wasn't just a desperate son. They were pawns. The battle wasn't just coming from inside my house. The true enemy was a faceless, powerful corporation, and they had sent their soldier right through my front door. The knowledge of Viridian Waterfront's involvement was a cold, heavy stone in my gut. Fear was part of it, yes, but something else was there too. A flicker of righteous anger, my grief for Arthur, my love for my son, my attachment to my home. They were being used as leverage in a corporate takeover. This was no longer just a family drama. This was a battle, and I had been a fool not to see it sooner. The next morning, I didn't make breakfast. I got dressed in my most respectable suit, the charcoal gray one I used to wear to board meetings, and drove to the law offices of Harris, Finch, and Associates. Mrs. Harris's office was a fortress of knowledge, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound legal volumes. The air smelled of old paper and quiet authority. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of calm competence that immediately set me at ease. She had been Arthur's lawyer, and now she was mine. Eleanor, thank you for coming in, she said, gesturing to a plush armchair opposite her large oak desk. Your call sounded urgent. There was no point in beating around the bush. I laid it all out for her. The coldness from Daniel, his chilling declaration that I was a guest, the panicked phone call about a debt, and finally, the name that tied it all together, Viridian Waterfront. She listened patiently, her hands steepled on her desk, not interrupting once. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. Instead, a slow, knowing smile touched her lips. Eleanor, she said, her voice calm. Arthur was a brilliant man. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a strategist. He loved you very much, and he foresaw that a day might come when you would need protection, not just from the outside world, but potentially from the inside as well. She swiveled in her chair and retrieved a thick burgundy folder from a locked cabinet. The front was marked Whitford Arthur, Last Will and Testament. She placed it on the desk between us. The seal was made of crimson wax, embossed with Arthur's family crest. Your husband's will isn't just a document, Eleanor. It's a fortress, and it has 3 very distinct, very strong walls of defense. She opened the folder and turned it to face me. The first wall is something you're likely aware of, the life estate. She pointed to a paragraph of dense legal text. In simple terms, this house and everything in it are legally yours to use and occupy until the day you die. You are not a guest. You are, for all legal intents and purposes, the master of this house. Daniel can't sell it. He can't mortgage it. And he certainly can't evict you. Not now. Not ever. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy. But Mrs. Harris held up a hand. That's just the outer wall. It protects you. The second wall allows you to fight back. My eyes widened. It's what Arthur called the residency clause. She continued, a glint in her eye. It states that any legal heir, namely Daniel, who chooses to reside in the property while you hold the life estate is required to pay fair market value rent determined by a third-party appraiser on a monthly basis. I stared at her speechless. Rent. He wanted his own son to pay rent. Arthur knew Daniel had a weakness for get-rich-quick schemes, Mrs. Harris explained gently. He worried Daniel might try to use this house as a free ride. This clause ensures that doesn't happen. Living here is not his right. It's a privilege he has to pay for. She then leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. But it's the third wall, Eleanor, that is the true masterstroke. It's what I like to call the time bomb. Arthur named it the legacy clause. She tapped a final critical paragraph. This clause dictates that in the event of your death, or if you are ever forced to relinquish your life estate against your will through coercion or duress, the ownership of the entire property does not pass to Daniel. Then who? I whispered. It passes, in its entirety and immediately, to the Savannah Heritage Preservation Fund. The air left my lungs. It was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was so perfectly Arthur. Mrs. Harris leaned back, letting the weight of it all sink in. Do you see, Eleanor? They can't get the house by waiting for you to die. They can't get it by forcing you out. If they try, the prize vanishes forever. Viridian Waterfront gets nothing. Melissa gets nothing. Daniel gets nothing. She looked at me, her gaze steady and firm. Their one and only path to victory is to break your spirit. They have to harass you, manipulate you, and wear you down until you willingly sign a document handing over your rights. That's their only move. I went from stunned to relieved, to a state of cold, clear understanding. I finally saw the whole board. This wasn't a simple eviction. This was a siege, and they were trying to starve me out from the inside. I looked out the window at the bustling Savannah streets, but I didn't see them. I saw a battlefield, and I finally knew the rules of engagement. Armed with the knowledge of Arthur's brilliant foresight, I was no longer a victim waiting for the next attack. I was a queen on a chessboard, and it was my turn to move. I called Daniel and Melissa to the dining room that evening under the pretense of a family financial meeting. The stage was set not for a meal, but for a reckoning. The long mahogany dining table, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the cold white light of the crystal chandelier. It felt less like a family gathering place, and more like a boardroom, or perhaps a courtroom. I sat at the head of the table, in the chair that had been Arthur's. To my right sat Mrs. Harris, a calm, formidable presence with a leather briefcase at her feet. Her attendance alone had already set Daniel on edge. He and Melissa sat opposite us, a tangible tension radiating from them. Daniel fidgeted with his cufflink, his eyes darting from me to the lawyer and back again. Melissa, however, was a picture of composure, her hands folded neatly on the table, her expression a mask of polite curiosity. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the moment build. Finally, I spoke, my voice even and clear, betraying none of the turmoil I'd felt just days before. Thank you both for coming. I won't beat around the bush. We need to formalize the living arrangements in this house. From her briefcase, Mrs. Harris produced 2 documents, sliding one across the polished wood towards them. It landed with a soft, definitive thud. "What is this?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "It's a lease agreement," I said simply. Daniel stared at the document as if it were a snake. He looked up at me, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury. "A what? You're kidding me. A lease? In my own family's home?" "According to your father's will," Mrs. Harris interjected, her tone crisp and professional. "Mrs. Whitford holds a life estate. Any heir residing on the property is required to pay fair market rent. It's all there in black and white." Daniel's face, which had been pale, now turned a blotchy red. "This is insane. I'm her son. You expect me to pay rent to my own mother?" He turned to me, his voice pleading and angry at the same time. "Mom, what is this? After everything I've been through?" "This has nothing to do with my feelings for you, Daniel," I said, my voice firm but not unkind. "This is about respecting the legal framework your father put in place to protect this home, to protect his legacy. You told me I was a guest here. Guests, as you know, often pay for their accommodations." The barb hit its mark. He recoiled, sputtering, unable to form a coherent sentence. He was all raw, wounded emotion. But Melissa was different. While Daniel was falling apart, she had calmly picked up the document. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the pages. She wasn't reading the emotional subtext. She was analyzing the terms of engagement. She took in the monthly rent figure, a hefty sum based on a recent appraisal, the clauses on property maintenance, the rules regarding guests. There was no shock on her face, only intense concentration. She read for a full minute in complete silence, the only sound in the room being Daniel's heavy, indignant breathing. When she finished, she placed the document neatly back on the table. She looked up, not at me, but at Mrs. Harris, a flicker of professional respect in her eyes. Then, her gaze shifted to me. She smiled, a thin, cold curve of her lips. "Of course, Mother," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "Everything should be clear and official. It's for the best." She reached into her purse, pulled out an elegant fountain pen, and uncapped it with a decisive click. Daniel watched, horrified. "Melissa, what are you doing? Don't sign that." She ignored him completely, her eyes locked with mine, a silent challenge passing between us. With a steady hand, she signed her name on the signature line, the flourish of the pen a declaration of war. The sound of the nib scratching across the heavy paper echoed in the silent room. It wasn't the sound of defeat. It was the gunshot signaling the start of a new, more brutal battle. She pushed the signed document back across the table. "There, all settled." I looked at her signature, then back at her chillingly calm face. I had won the first move, forcing their hand. But her signature wasn't a surrender. It was an acceptance of the terms. She was telling me, without a single word, that she was ready to play the game, no matter the cost. My victory felt hollow, replaced by the cold certainty that the real fight for my home and my soul had only just begun. Signing the lease agreement wasn't the end of the battle. It was the beginning of the war. A cold war, fought not with raised voices but with silent, calculated acts of psychological sabotage. The gloves were off, and Melissa began her campaign immediately. Her strategy was clear. She couldn't force me out, so she would make my sanctuary so unbearable that I would run out on my own. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and she was the master of the blade. It started 2 nights later. I was woken from a deep sleep by a throbbing bass sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Music, loud and intrusive, was blasting from the downstairs living room. I looked at the clock. It was 1 in the morning. I put on my robe, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and apprehension, and went to investigate. My living room was filled with strangers. Young, loud, fashionably dressed people I had never seen before were dancing, spilling drinks on my Persian rug, and laughing at a volume that felt like a physical assault. Daniel was in a corner, looking deeply uncomfortable. But Melissa was in her element, gliding through the crowd like a queen, a triumphant smile on her face. She saw me standing on the stairs and waved, her expression one of perfect innocence. "Mother, I'm so glad you're up. Come and meet our friends," she shouted over the din. I just stood there, frozen, a ghost in my own home. The next morning, the house reeked of stale alcohol and perfume. There was a dark, sticky stain on the rug. Melissa was in the kitchen, humming as she made coffee. "Good morning," she chirped. "Did the music bother you? I am so terribly sorry. A few friends just dropped by to celebrate a new business opportunity for Daniel. We lost track of time." It was a blatant lie, delivered with the sweetest of smiles. There was no business opportunity. This was a show of force, a demonstration that my rules, my peace, no longer mattered. The next cut came a few days later. In the solarium sat a prized orchid, a delicate white phalaenopsis that Arthur had given me on our last anniversary together. I watered it, fed it, and tended to it with a devotion that bordered on religious. It was a living piece of my husband's love. One afternoon, I walked in to find its petals shriveled and brown, its leaves limp and yellowed. The soil was bone dry. It had been starved of water for days. I felt a sharp, physical pain in my chest. I knew I hadn't forgotten it. I never forgot. Melissa appeared in the doorway, a look of theatrical horror on her face. "Oh my goodness, your beautiful orchid," she gasped, rushing over. "Oh, Eleanor, I am a complete idiot. I moved it to dust the table last week and must have forgotten to put it back in its usual spot. It's all my fault. I'm so sorry." She wasn't sorry. She was targeting my memories, killing the things I loved one by one, and then feigning clumsiness to add insult to injury. The final and most visible assault was on my garden. My lawn was my pride and joy, a perfect rolling carpet of emerald green that led down to the river. It required a meticulous watering schedule managed by an automatic sprinkler system. A week after the orchid died, I noticed yellow patches appearing in the grass. Within 2 weeks, my beautiful lawn was a sad, dying tapestry of green and brown. "The sprinkler system must be on the fritz," Melissa said with a sigh, looking out the window. "Such a shame. These old houses, they require so much upkeep, don't they? It's hard to stay on top of everything when you're all alone." Her words were the true poison. Each broken object, each dead plant, each chaotic night was designed to build a narrative. "You're too old. You can't manage this place. You're failing." I felt exhausted. The house, once my refuge, had become a minefield. I was constantly on edge, walking on eggshells, waiting for the next subtle act of cruelty. For a fleeting moment, I felt the pull of surrender. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was too much. That evening, I stood in Arthur's study, feeling the weight of defeat settle on my shoulders. My gaze fell upon his portrait above the fireplace, He looked out with that steady, confident expression, his eyes seeming to hold a spark of the same resolve I had seen in Mrs. Harris's office. He had built this fortress for me. He had trusted me to defend it. I thought of Melissa's smug smile, of the strangers dancing on my rug, of my withered orchid. The exhaustion was burned away by a sudden hot surge of anger. This wasn't just about a house. This was about my life with Arthur, our shared history, our legacy. I would not let a corporate predator in a designer dress tear it all down with cheap psychological games. I straightened my shoulders, the weariness replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She had started a war of attrition. Fine, I would show her just how much I had in reserve. The psychological war raged on for another week, a steady rhythm of small cruelties and feigned apologies. I held my ground, meeting each of Melissa's provocations with a calm, unshakable resolve that I knew was driving her mad. But my anger towards Daniel was a different matter. It had hardened into a cold, heavy stone in my heart. He was a willing accomplice, a traitor to his own family, and I could barely stand to look at him. That all changed on a Tuesday evening, just as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, when I saw movement in the backyard near the wrought iron gate that led to the river walk. A man was standing there. He wasn't one of the usual tourists or joggers. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a dark tailored suit that seemed out of place in the humid savannah air. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, simply staring at the house. There was an unnerving stillness about him, the coiled energy of a predator. Just then, Daniel walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water. He glanced out the window, and the color drained from his face. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the tile floor, but he didn't even flinch. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it made my breath catch in my throat. "Daniel?" I asked. But he didn't hear me. He was already moving, practically sprinting towards the back door. "Stay here," he hissed over his shoulder, his voice tight with panic. "Don't come out." I ignored him. I moved to the large bay window in the dining room, which offered a clear, unobstructed view of the back lawn. I watched as Daniel stumbled out, his hands held up in a placating gesture. He started talking before he even reached the man, his voice too low for me to hear. But his frantic body language spoke volumes. He was begging. The man in the suit listened without a single change in expression. He was the picture of calm, dangerous authority. He let Daniel talk himself out, his words tumbling over one another in a desperate torrent. When Daniel finally fell silent, the man slowly removed one hand from his pocket. I braced myself, my mind flashing with terrible possibilities. But he didn't strike him. He simply reached out and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. It looked almost friendly, but I saw Daniel flinch as if he'd been burned. The man said something, just a few quiet words. Then he turned his head, and his eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, locked directly onto mine through the window. It was a look of pure, predatory assessment. He was sizing me up, evaluating the asset, the obstacle. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. Then he gave Daniel's shoulder one last, firm pat, turned, and walked away as calmly as he had arrived. Daniel stood frozen for a long moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked broken. The anger I had been nursing for weeks suddenly evaporated, replaced by a sickening wave of pity and a new, more potent fear. My son wasn't a wolf, circling his aging mother. He was a lamb, tethered to a post, and a much bigger, much more dangerous wolf was circling him. And I knew, with a certainty that made me feel ill, that Melissa was the one holding the rope. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that man's cold eyes was burned into my mind. Around midnight, when the house was silent, I crept into the small study Daniel had been using as a temporary office. It was tidy, Melissa's influence, no doubt, but I had a desperate need to find something, anything, that would explain the terror I had seen on my son's face. I found it in the small wastebasket beside the desk. It was a single piece of paper, crumpled into a tight ball. My hands trembled as I smoothed it out. It was a notice, but not from any bank or credit card company. The letterhead was just a single, stylized initial. It was a demand for payment. The amount listed made me gasp. It was a staggering sum, far more than what a failed restaurant could have possibly owed. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that made my blood run cold. It wasn't a polite reminder. It was a threat, written in crude block letters. The interest is accruing. So are the consequences. We know where you live. Everything clicked into place. The desperation, the panic, the willingness to betray his own mother. My son wasn't driven by greed. He was driven by abject fear. He hadn't just made a bad business deal. He had gotten into bed with sharks, and now they were coming to collect, not just with interest, but with blood. The crumpled note from the wastebasket felt like a piece of ice in my pocket. My son was not a monster. He was a hostage. And his fear was a weapon being used against both of us. The complex web of deceit, debt, and corporate greed was more tangled than I could have ever imagined. I was out of my depth, and I knew I couldn't fight this battle alone. There was only one person I trusted to help me navigate these treacherous waters. The next morning, I met Thomas Abernathy at a quiet cafe tucked away on a cobblestone street. The air inside smelled of roasted coffee and old books, a comforting contrast to the stench of fear that had permeated my home. I looked terrible, and I knew it. I hadn't slept, and the worry was etched onto my face. "Good heavens, Eleanor," Thomas said as I sat down, his kind eyes filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Worse, Thomas," I replied, my voice low. "I've seen the truth." I didn't waste any time. I laid out the whole ugly story, from the guest comment to the lease agreement, from the campaign of psychological warfare to the terrifying man in the suit. Finally, I took out the crumpled note and slid it across the table. I told him about the Viridian waterfront logo I'd seen on Melissa's portfolio. I told him everything. He listened, his expression growing more grave with every word. He smoothed out the threatening note, his historian's fingers treating it like a fragile, dangerous artifact. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out at the tourists meandering past the window. "A wolf in sheep's clothing," he finally murmured, his gaze returning to me, hard as granite. "And she's led the whole pack right to your door." He tapped a finger on the table. "Viridian is one thing, Eleanor, but this note, this speaks to something far more thuggish. These aren't corporate lawyers. These are vultures." "What can I do, Thomas?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Daniel is trapped." "First, we need to prove it," he said, his voice taking on a new determined edge. "We need to connect Melissa directly to Viridian. A hunch isn't enough. We need a smoking gun." He leaned forward. "In this town, Eleanor, history has a way of leaving a paper trail. People think the past is buried, but it's all there if you know which archives to dust off. Give me 2 days." True to his word, he called me exactly 48 hours later. "Meet me at my office," was all he said. His office was a wonderful, cluttered space above an antique shop filled with maps, historical documents, and the quiet dignity of the past. He had 2 documents laid out on his large oak desk. He didn't say a word, just gestured for me to look. The first was a printout of an old internal corporate newsletter from Viridian Waterfront, dated 3 years ago. The headline read, "Celebrating our top performers." And there she was, a picture of Melissa smiling brightly, shaking hands with a senior executive. The caption below was what made my breath catch in my throat. Melissa Sterling, her maiden name, is once again our employee of the quarter, recognized for her outstanding and aggressive tactics in project development and land acquisition. Land acquisition. The corporate speak for taking people's homes. My hand trembled as I reached for the second document. It was a large architectural drawing, a development plan. It showed a sprawling, luxurious resort complex along the riverfront. I saw the familiar outlines of neighboring properties, all marked as acquired. And there, in the very center, the undeniable centerpiece of the entire project, was my home. It was labeled not with our address, but with a title that dripped with corporate avarice, the Crown Jewel Villa. I sank into a chair, the papers slipping from my fingers. It all made a sickening kind of sense. The courtship, the whirlwind romance, the sudden marriage to a man in financial trouble who just so happened to be the sole heir to the most critical piece of property Viridian needed. It wasn't a love story. It was a corporate merger. My son hadn't found a wife. He had been targeted by a specialist, an expert in acquiring land from vulnerable families. And I wasn't just an inconvenient mother-in-law. I was the final obstacle, the last holdout, the jewel that had to be pried from its setting, no matter the cost. Every smile, every kind word, every moment of feigned family affection had been a lie, a carefully executed step in a long-term hostile takeover. The trap was set. I called it a family meeting regarding financial matters, a formal, sterile phrase designed to ensure their attendance. The chosen venue was not the dining room, but Arthur's study. It was a room that commanded respect, a room of authority, and tonight, it would serve as my courtroom. The air was thick with unspoken accusations before a single word was uttered. I sat behind Arthur's mahogany desk, the polished wood cool and solid beneath my hands. The evidence lay in a neat folder before me. To my left sat Mrs. Harris, her posture perfect, her expression neutral but radiating legal authority. To my right was Thomas Abernathy, his presence a quiet historical testament to the legacy they had tried to destroy. We were the council, the protectors of the Queen, and the board was finally set for the endgame. Daniel and Melissa entered, and I saw them falter for a moment at the sight of my assembled allies. Daniel's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of a trapped animal. He knew this was no simple discussion about household bills. Melissa, however, quickly regained her composure, her mask of polite concern clicking firmly into place. "Mother," she said, her voice smooth. "Mrs. Harris, Mr. Abernathy, what a formal gathering. Is everything all right?" They sat in the two leather armchairs facing the desk, like defendants before a judge. I didn't answer her question. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. I watched them, letting them stew in the tension. Daniel couldn't sit still, his leg jiggling nervously. Melissa sat perfectly poised, but I saw the slight tight clenching of her jaw. Finally, I opened the folder. I didn't speak. I simply took out the first document, the printout of the Viridian Waterfront newsletter, and slid it across the desk. It came to a stop directly in front of Melissa. Daniel leaned over to see. I watched his face as he processed the image. Melissa, younger, beaming, shaking hands with a man in a suit. His brow furrowed in confusion as he read the headline, "Celebrating our top performers." "What's this?" he asked, looking at me. "Some old award Melissa won?" I remained silent, my gaze fixed on my daughter-in-law. Melissa forced a light laugh, but it sounded like breaking glass. Oh, that old thing. From a lifetime ago. I did a bit of commercial real estate before I met Daniel. It was dreadfully boring. She made to push the paper aside, a dismissive gesture, but I wasn't finished. I took out the second document, the architectural plan for the resort, and laid it on top of the first. I used my finger to trace the property lines, stopping deliberately on the large central plot marked the Crown Jewel Villa. This time, the penny dropped for Daniel. I saw the exact moment the blood drained from his face. His eyes darted from the map to the picture of his wife, and then to me. The confusion was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The frantic phone calls, the mysterious debt, Melissa's sudden interest in the house deeds, his own cruel words to me. It all slammed into him at once. He looked at Melissa, his expression one of utter betrayal, as if seeing her for the very first time. "Melissa," he whispered, his voice cracking. "What is this?" For the first time since I had known her, Melissa's composure finally shattered. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated. Panic flashed in her eyes, raw and unguarded. "It's nothing," she snapped, her voice suddenly sharp, losing its silky veneer. "It's a misunderstanding. That was an old proposal, a project that never went anywhere. Your mother is twisting things, trying to drive a wedge between us." She looked at me, her eyes pleading and furious at the same time. "Tell him, Eleanor. Tell him this is just some paranoid fantasy you've cooked up." Her voice trembled on the last few words. It was the tremor that condemned her. The lie was too big, the evidence too damning. She was caught red-handed, and she knew it. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I just held her gaze, letting my silence be the verdict. In that quiet, heavy moment, the truth was louder than any accusation I could have ever made. The room was no longer a study. It was a tomb for her deception. And we all stood there, watching her bury herself. The silence in the study was a physical weight, pressing down on us. Melissa's panicked denial hung in the air, a flimsy shield against the mountain of evidence on the desk. Her mask was gone, and what was left was ugly and desperate. I had her cornered. It was time to end the game. I rose slowly from my chair, the movement deliberate, commanding. The room, which had been her stage, was now my courtroom, and I was the judge. I looked first at my son. His face was a canvas of confusion and horror, his world tilting on its axis. "She played you, Daniel," I said, my voice not loud, but sharp enough to cut through his shock. It was devoid of pity, filled only with a cold, hard truth. All of it. The chance meeting, the whirlwind romance. It was a business transaction. You weren't a husband. You were an acquisition, a means to an end. You're just a pawn in her game. His head snapped towards Melissa, a wounded, questioning look in his eyes. "Is that true?" Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She was trapped. I then turned my full attention to her. She flinched under my gaze. "And you," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. "You have lost. You were so focused on breaking my spirit. You never considered that my husband was 10 steps ahead of you. You never considered the third wall of his fortress." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Mrs. Harris chose that moment to speak, her voice adding the weight of the law to my words. "The legacy clause," she stated simply. "The third and final provision of Mr. Whitford's will. It dictates," I continued, savoring the moment, "that if I am ever coerced into giving up my rights to this house, or upon my death, the entire estate does not pass to Daniel. It is transferred immediately and irrevocably to the Savannah Heritage Preservation Fund." I let the words sink in. Viridian Waterfront will never get this land. Not through you, not through Daniel, not through anyone. The jig is up. Your entire scheme, your sham of a marriage, it was all for nothing. Melissa's face crumpled. The calculating professional vanished, replaced by a desperate gambler who had just lost everything on a final, foolish bet. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, you're lying. We are not, Mrs. Harris said coolly. And beyond that, we now have substantial evidence of a conspiracy to commit fraud, using a marriage to fraudulently gain access to and control over an asset. Viridian's lawyers will have a field day with this, but I assure you, so will the district attorney. Just as the last of Melissa's composure was about to shatter, a sound cut through the tension. Ding dong. The doorbell. Its cheerful melodic chime was grotesquely out of place in the funereal atmosphere of the study. Daniel and Melissa both jumped at the sound. I, however, remained perfectly still. I had been expecting it. It was the final nail in the coffin I had so carefully constructed. I'll get it, Thomas said, rising from his chair with a grim look on his face. We heard his footsteps in the hall, the sound of the front door opening, and a brief, muffled exchange of words. He returned a moment later, holding a crisp, white envelope. He didn't look at me or Melissa. He walked directly to Daniel and held it out. This is for you, son. Daniel took it, his hands trembling. He tore it open. As he read the document inside, his face went from pale to ashen. He looked up, his eyes wide with a new, more immediate terror. It's a formal summons, he stammered. From them. They're calling in the debt. All of it. Now. He looked at Melissa, and the last shred of loyalty, of affection, of shared history was incinerated by pure, unadulterated hatred. You, he choked out, his voice a raw, broken thing. You did this. You knew they were coming for me. You pushed me to do this to my own mother. And for what? For nothing. He collapsed back into the chair, his head in his hands, and began to sob. Deep, ragged, hopeless sounds of a man whose world had just been utterly and completely destroyed. Melissa stared at him, then at me, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal looking for an escape that wasn't there. The mask was gone. The poise was gone. The brilliant, ruthless land acquisition specialist was gone. All that remained was a desperate, defeated woman who had been outplayed, outmaneuvered, and utterly ruined. After Mrs. Harris and Thomas had gone, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the house. The storm had passed, leaving wreckage in its wake. There were no more tears from Daniel, only a hollow, shell-shocked stillness. From upstairs, I heard the quiet, efficient sounds of drawers opening and closing. Melissa wasn't throwing a tantrum or smashing things. She was simply erasing herself from my home with the same cold precision she had used to invade it. An hour later, I saw the headlights of a taxi sweep across the living room wall. I didn't go to the window. I didn't need to. I heard the front door open and close with a soft click. There was no goodbye, no final, venomous parting shot. She just vanished into the night, a ghost who had failed in her haunting. The house seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief, the very air feeling cleaner, lighter. I found Daniel sitting in the dark in the living room, slumped in the same wingback chair where he had delivered his cruel pronouncement. He was just a silhouette against the faint moonlight filtering through the windows. The arrogant man of the house was gone, replaced by a broken boy drowning in the ruins of his own making. The sight didn't fill me with triumph, only a profound, aching sadness. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked over and stood before him, a shadow in the darkness. He didn't look up. She's gone, he said, his voice a dead, empty monotone. I know. He was waiting for the lecture, for the recriminations, For the "I told you so." He was waiting for me to pour salt in the wounds he so richly deserved. A part of me, the wounded, angry part, wanted to do just that. But looking at the pathetic figure he cut, I knew it would be a hollow victory. Kicking a man when he's already hit rock bottom serves no purpose. "The men you owe," I said, my voice calm and measured. "The ones who sent the man in the suit. This is not a business debt, is it, Daniel?" He shook his head, a barely perceptible movement in the gloom. "No," he whispered. "They're not businessmen." I had suspected as much. These were predators of a different kind, and they would not be satisfied with legal proceedings. They would tear him apart, and my home, my family name, would be collateral damage. Arthur had protected the house, but I had to decide what to do with the son who had tried to burn it down. "I am going to make you an offer," I said, the words tasting like metal in my mouth. "I will use my own personal funds, money that has nothing to do with your father or this house, to pay them off. I will settle this debt completely and finally." He looked up then, a flicker of disbelief and desperate hope in his eyes. "Mom, you would... but it comes with conditions." I cut him off, my voice hardening. I would not allow him to mistake this for an act of maternal softness. This was a transaction, just like his marriage had been. "The moment the debt is cleared, you will pack a bag and you will leave this house. You will find a job, any job. A waiter, a stock boy, I don't care. You will earn your own money. You will pay your own rent, and you will stand on your own 2 feet. You will receive nothing further from me. Not a dollar, not a phone call. You will be cut loose, entirely on your own." The hope in his eyes died, replaced by the stark reality of his situation. This wasn't a rescue, it was an exile. "This isn't forgiveness, Daniel," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. "Forgiveness is not on the table tonight. This is a business deal. I am buying my peace of mind and protecting the family name from the gutter you've dragged it into. In return, I am giving you one final chance to rebuild your life as a man, not as a spoiled, frightened boy." The truth, stark and unvarnished, finally broke him. A sound tore from his throat, a raw, guttural sob of pure anguish. He doubled over, his face in his hands, and wept. For the first time in years, I saw my son cry like a child. These weren't the crocodile tears of a man caught in a lie. They were the scalding tears of shame, of loss, of the crushing weight of his own failure. But beneath it all, I sensed something else. The fragile, painful sound of a cage door creaking open. It was the sound of a man finally, utterly, and devastatingly being set free. 6 months can feel like a lifetime. The oppressive, chilly autumn that had mirrored the Cold War within my home had given way to a brilliant Savannah spring. The air, once thick with tension and deceit, was now fresh with the scent of jasmine and the salty tang of the river. The house was breathing again, its old timbers seeming to settle into a peaceful, contented rhythm. And so was I. I was on the veranda, a place I had avoided during the siege, but which was now my favorite spot once more. The morning sun was warm on my face. Beside me, Thomas Abernathy was looking over a set of architectural sketches spread across the wrought iron table. My once dying lawn was a vibrant emerald green again, and the new orchids in the solarium were thriving. "I think adding the welcome kiosk here, just off the main path, will be the least intrusive," he said, tapping a point on the drawing with his pen. "It keeps the historical integrity of the facade intact." "I agree," I said, taking a sip of my tea. "It needs to feel like an invitation, not a ticket booth." We were reviewing the final plans to open the ground floor and gardens to the public for weekend historical tours. The partnership with the Savannah Heritage Preservation Fund, The very organization that had been my ace in the hole was now a joyful reality. The house was no longer a fortress to be defended, but a legacy to be shared. Tucked into the corner of the sketchbook was a postcard that had arrived the week before. It was a simple, generic picture of the skyline of a city 1,000 miles away. The handwriting on the back was Daniel's, neat and steady in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Mom," it read, "the new job is going well. It's hard work, but it's honest. I hope you are too. D." There was no return address. I hadn't expected one. I had paid his debt, and he had kept his end of the bargain. He had walked out of the house that night with a single bag and hadn't looked back. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful phone calls. But this small 5-sentence message was more meaningful than any grand apology. It was the sound of a man turning a new leaf, of a life being rebuilt from the ground up, brick by painful brick. I felt a quiet pang, not of sadness, but of a mother's distant, cautious hope. He was on his own path now, and for the first time in a long time, it seemed to be leading somewhere other than ruin. "That was a masterstroke, you know," Thomas said, looking up from the plans, his eyes twinkling. "What Arthur did with that will. He played the long game better than anyone I ever knew." "He always did," I smiled. "He trusted that I would know how to play the final hand." I looked out at the river, the water sparkling under the morning sun like a carpet of diamonds. The ghosts of the past few months, Melissa's predatory smile, Daniel's desperate eyes, the cold stare of the man in the suit, felt like scenes from a bad dream, faded and powerless in the bright light of this new day. I had won, but the victory wasn't in the legal clauses or the exposed conspiracies. The real victory was here, in this quiet moment. It was in the peaceful silence of my home, in the budding roses in my garden, in the knowledge that the legacy Arthur and I had built would now be preserved for generations. I was no longer a guest in my own home, nor was I merely its owner. I had become something more. I was its guardian, its keeper, the sentinel of its story. My son had once told me I was just a guest here. In a way, he was right. We are all just temporary guests in the grand houses of our lives. But while I was here, I had defended my right to be the master of my own room, to live with dignity and on my own terms. And that was a victory no one could ever take away. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment 1 below. If not, feel free to comment 0 so we know and can improve future videos. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching.